I paid $30,000 to join my family's Europe trip. I was at the airport, ticket in hand, or so I thought, until my dad turned to me and said, "I forgot your ticket. Just go home." He hadn't forgotten. They had planned to leave me behind with my grandma, thinking we'd both just fade into the background. But I stayed with her, and we made our own plans. 3 weeks later, they walked off that plane, all smiles, until they saw me standing beside a man in a suit. The color drained from their faces because that man was holding the papers that would change everything. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments? Or tell me where you're from. I love hearing how far my story reaches. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. If you want to hear more stories like this about family betrayal and standing up for what's right, please subscribe to the channel. My name is Zephyr Kane, and this is what really happened. It was late afternoon in Pine Hollow, Oregon, the kind of golden light that slid in low through the blinds and pooled in soft stripes across my small apartment floor. I'd just finished a grueling shift at the hospital, 30 patients, 2 emergencies, and the familiar hum of the old MRI machine still lodged in my ears. I dropped my bag in the corner and sat down at my desk, where the marigold painting my grandmother, Margot Wren, had given me hung above the chair like a quiet sentinel. Beside it sat the leather-bound notebook she'd pressed into my hands the last summer I spent under her roof. On the first page in her steady, slightly slanted script, she had written, "Write down the things worth remembering, Zephyr." I reached for my phone without thinking, more out of habit than intention, and there it was, Instagram's uninvited little gift. 12 years ago today. The algorithm served up a photograph of me at 18, lanky and awkward, my arm around Grandma Margot at the Seattle-Tacoma airport. She wore a soft blue sweater, held her battered old suitcase in one hand, and smiled the kind of smile that made you feel like you belonged in the world. I remembered the way her hand felt in mine. I also remembered how just hours after that shutter clicked, her smile had vanished, and nothing between us and the rest of the family was ever the same. My chest tightened, that familiar dull ache spreading. That day had been my first true lesson in what family could really mean, and what it could take away from you. If I had fought harder, said something louder, would it have made any difference? Would she have been spared even a fraction of the hurt? Through the window, Pine Hollow looked the same as it always had. Tall pines dark against the burning horizon, the river threading silver through the valley. The place where she had taught me how to bake apple cookies, how to wrap a wound, how to listen with my whole attention. So far removed from Boise, Idaho, the house I grew up in, all neat lawns and cold dinners where the clink of cutlery filled the silence between my parents' perfunctory house school, Zephyr. I opened her notebook and began to write, my pen moving faster than my thoughts. Tell it so the promise holds, never let them hurt her again. I didn't yet know where to start, but certain markers were impossible to ignore: a large sum of money, a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Europe, and a ticket for my grandmother that had never truly existed. I closed the notebook, took a sip of coffee, gone lukewarm, and breathed in the scent of the old cedar furniture. If this story was going to be told, it would start where it all began, spring of my 18th year, when my father first told me about the trip of a lifetime. When I think about my childhood, I see 2 versions of home. The first was the suburban house in Boise, where my father, Malcolm Reed, buried himself in blueprints and bridge designs, and my mother, Evelyn, lived by columns and rows on a spreadsheet. Dinners were a formality, a bland rotation of meals eaten to the soundtrack of silverware on ceramic, punctuated only by a clipped "How's school?" and an even quicker nod when I answered. I moved through that space like a shadow, present but unseen. And then there was the other home, Grandma Margot's cedar-sided house in Pine Hollow. Summers there were the only months that felt real. Her back porch was a riot of wildflowers, and her vegetable garden brimmed with pumpkins and green beans. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of apple cookies cooling on wire racks, mingled with the faint medicinal note of antiseptic, a holdover from her decades as a nurse. In the evening, she'd settle into the armchair and tell me stories about the patients she'd stayed up all night to save. She taught me to knit lopsided scarves and how to follow a recipe without rushing. Sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, she'd sit by the window, fingertips resting on the frame of a family photograph. Her, my father, my Aunt Celeste, and me. Her eyes would drift far away, somewhere I couldn't follow. Aunt Celeste, my father's younger sister, lived in Bend with her husband Warren, a real estate developer, who measured success in luxury square footage. Their kids Harper and Liam were polite in the way children are when they've been reminded to be, but they rarely looked up from their phones. Visits from them were rare, and phone calls to Grandma on holidays carried the polished distance of obligation. It was in the spring of my senior year of high school that my father called with what he framed as thrilling news. The entire family was going to Europe, Paris, Rome, Florence, and he emphasized Mom will be coming too. My mother chimed in to declare it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, adding that Celeste, Warren, Harper, and Liam would be joining us. Then came the condition. My parents suggested that Grandma contribute $30,000 to cover her ticket accommodations and travel insurance. She hesitated, citing her health, but I jumped in before the pause could stretch. "I'll take care of you the whole trip, Grandma. Please come." She sighed, her eyes softening. "If it's what you want, then I'll go." From there, a strange warmth seemed to spread through the family. My father began calling her more often, inquiring about her blood pressure, her diet. Celeste sent an expensive silk scarf with a note. "You'll look perfect in this on the Champs-Élysées." Then one weekend, the entire Boise contingent descended on Pine Hollow for an impromptu gathering, store-bought cake on paper plates, Harper and Liam scrolling on their phones in the corner. Late that evening, as I walked past the kitchen, I caught my mother's voice low and conspiratorial over the phone. "Transfer it into Warren's company account. It's easier that way. Just tell her it's for insurance and the deposit on the tour." I stood in the doorway for a moment, unseen, my pulse spiking. I didn't understand the whole picture yet, but unease settled in my stomach like a stone. Something about this trip, this sudden surge of familial affection, wasn't what it seemed. The next morning, I drove Grandma to the bank because she preferred to handle important things face-to-face, and because I needed to see something with my own eyes. The lobby smelled faintly of printer toner and citrus cleaner, and the fluorescent lights hummed like a tired hive. Rose, her longtime friend and teller, waved us over with a smile that softened when she noticed the crease between Grandma's brows. "Morning, Margot." "Morning, Zephyr," she said. "What can I help you with?" Grandma explained that she wanted to make sure the travel funds were in order. Rose nodded and clicked through screen after screen. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. "Looks like the transfer went through last week," she said, printing out a sheet and sliding it across the counter. 30,000 even. I read the payee line twice. Blake & Co. Travel Ltd. I felt the name more than saw it. Blake. Warren's last name. The paper was warm from the printer and too light for the weight I heard in it. "Is that a tour company?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Rose's expression shifted into the careful politeness of someone constrained by policy. "It's listed as a travel services vendor," she said. "Insurance and deposit bundles are common for trips like this." Then, in a slightly lower voice, "You should keep a copy of this in your records." She stamped the page and slipped a second copy into an envelope with the bank's logo. "If you want more detail on coverage, it's best to ask the organizer." Grandma thanked her, and Rose reached over the counter to pat her hand. "You're going to have a beautiful time," she said, like a blessing. Back at the house, Warren's SUV was already in the driveway, sunlight flashing off chrome. Inside, he was leaning against the kitchen island with a glass of sparkling water, holding court as if the room were a showroom. "Premium seats," he announced. 2A and 2B. "You'll never want to fly any other way once you try the lie-flat." Because Mom's older Celeste added breezing in with a garment bag, we upgraded the whole plan to make things easier. I scanned the faces around me. Harper and Liam were hunched over their phones at the dining table, thumbs moving screens, reflecting in their eyes. No one said a word about Grandma's seat. "What's her seat number?" I asked, forcing an easy tone. "Your father's handling the itinerary," Celeste said, smiling tightly. "It's all streamlined." When Dad and Mom arrived an hour later, I pulled Dad aside near the hall tree where Grandma kept her raincoat and a jar of buttons. "Can I get the booking code?" I asked. "I'll check her in early, request a wheelchair for the connection, make sure she's near the aisle." He tightened his jaw the way he did when a junior engineer questioned his design. "I've got it," he said. "Don't worry." "I'm not worried," I said. "I'm preparing." "It's under control," he replied, ending the conversation as neatly as he filed blueprints. After dinner, I took out the trash. The evening air smelled like damp earth and wood smoke from a neighbor's stove. When I lifted the lid of the recycling bin, a folded sheet had landed awkwardly on top of the magazines. I shouldn't have looked. I did. It was a printout, passenger names, flight numbers, a neat grid of letters and numbers. My eyes landed on Margot Wren and then snagged on the faint graphite mark someone had dragged through it. In the margin in square handwriting, 2 letters, WLCXL. I stood under the porch light, letting the moths orbit the bulb, and tried to slow my breathing. Waitlisted or canceled. For a moment, I told myself there had to be an explanation, some temporary error, a duplicate record. I slid the paper back where I'd found it and went inside. I used the landline in Grandma's living room because it was quiet there, and because she'd always said that real business happened on a real phone. The airline rep answered on the 3rd ring. I gave her the group name and the route. Keys clicked. "I'm seeing a group of 7, she said, and it looks like 6 are confirmed. One named Margot Wren is currently listed as canceled. The change was made about 3 weeks ago." My grip tightened on the receiver. "Canceled by whom?" I asked. "I'm not authorized to see who requested the change," she said apologetically, "but I can confirm the status." I thanked her and hung up. The grandfather clock in the hall marked the hour, steady and indifferent. I found Dad by the sink rinsing a wine glass, sleeves rolled to his elbows. "The airline says Grandma's reservation was canceled," I said. 3 weeks ago." He didn't turn around. "Systems glitch all the time," he said. "Don't let some call center agent wind you up." "Then give me the booking code," I said more sharply than I intended. "I'll fix it." He set the glass down harder than necessary. Water flared and fell back. Zephyr, do not create a problem where there isn't one. Mom entered, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Emotions run high before big trips," she said lightly. "Let's keep perspective." Perspective. I swallowed it like a bitter pill. Later in Grandma's room, I found her folding cardigans into neat stacks. The worn suitcase lay open at the foot of the bed, its leather softened by thousands of miles of ordinary life. She lifted the silk scarf Celeste had sent and smoothed it with her palms before tucking it into a corner just so. "We're really going," she said. Her face flushed with the glow of anticipation. "Can you imagine me in Paris? I said, and I could. I also saw a boarding gate and a departure screen and the way a smile could disappear without warning. "I'll be at your side from the second we walk into the airport," I added. "If anything goes wrong, it goes wrong with me, not you." She patted the space next to her on the bed. "You've always been steady, Zephyr," she said softly. "When I hold on to you, the ground doesn't tilt." I sat, and the mattress sighed beneath our weight. "No one is going to take this joy away from you," I told her, speaking as much to myself as to her. "Not this time." When I turned off the light, the room glowed with the square of moon in the window, and the suitcase at the foot of the bed looked ready, patient, faithful, and older than the trip it was promised. We left before sunrise, the taxi's headlights tunneling through dark stands of pine. Grandma wore her gray cardigan and the silk scarf Celeste had sent tied simply at her throat. Her suitcase, strapped with a frayed leather belt, thumped gently against my knee with every curve in the road. She watched the trees go by and hummed a melody I recognized from the radio she kept on the kitchen counter. By the time we reached Seattle-Tacoma, the terminal was already alive. The smell of strong coffee drifted from the Starbucks near security, and the loudspeaker announced boarding zones in a cheerful monotone. Wheels rattled over tile. A baby cried. I took Grandma's elbow as we navigated the check-in area. Celeste and Warren were easy to spot, standing at the head of a line near the airline counter, 2 sleek suitcases and a pair of duty-free shopping bags from the city, as if the trip had already started. Harper and Liam leaned against a column, faces lit by their screens. Neither looked up when Grandma lifted her hand in a small wave. My parents arrived minutes later. "Follow me," Dad said, waving us forward like a foreman. At the counter, I smiled at the attendant and gave our name. She typed, glanced at the screen, typed again. A small line appeared between her brows. "I've got the group," she said, "but I'm not seeing a confirmed reservation for Margot Wren." The air shifted. Grandma turned her head toward me, a question gathering in her eyes. Could you check the group list again? I asked, keeping my voice even. Dad stepped in, placing his palm on the counter as if he could press the problem flat. It's a system thing, he said. But my mother's not up for a trip like this, not really. She should go home and rest. We'll plan something more suitable later. Something hot hit the space behind my ribs. She paid $30,000, I said. My voice echoed more than I expected, bouncing off windows and the aluminum frame of the conveyor belt. Zephyr Mom said, soft and warning at once, no one wants a scene. Celeste's smile was a cold, precise crescent. Don't be dramatic. You're going to ruin this for everyone. Warren leaned closer to the agent. Just process the rest of us, he said in the tone of a man accustomed to being accommodated. The attendant, to her credit, didn't move right away. She pulled up a manifest, printed it, and slid it to me. 6 names were neatly listed with seat assignments. Next to Margot Wren, a code in the remarks column made my stomach drop, CXL. The date next to it matched the week Rose had printed on the transfer slip. Who requested the change, I asked, not taking my eyes off my father. He looked past me as if the terminal had suddenly become fascinating. We're going to miss the window for checked baggage, he said. Let's go. They gathered their things as if nothing had been said, as if there were no woman in a gray cardigan standing very still beneath a banner that promised world-class service. Their suitcases chirped obediently behind them. I stayed where I was. Grandma's hand found my sleeve. Don't, she whispered. Don't let them drag you into a fight. I'm not going anywhere, I said. My throat felt tight. Neither are you. The attendant cleared her throat. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said gently to Grandma. Would you like me to see about a later flight, or I can escort you to ground transportation? Grandma shook her head. The scarf Celeste had sent didn't seem to belong to her anymore. No, she said almost to herself. No. I watched my family disappear into the security line, watched the way they kept their eyes forward, watched the moment they passed the point of no return without once turning back. Then I turned to Grandma. We're going home, I said. In the taxi, the city gave way to the highway and the highway to the trees. The late afternoon sun burned through low clouds and set the tops of the pines on fire. I stared at the back of the driver's headrest and listened to the tick of the turn signal and the muted sound of Grandma's breathing beside me. At some point, she lifted the framed family photo she'd packed in her carry-on, the one from the living room shelf, and held it in her lap like a fragile parcel. Her face was calm in the way faces are when they have traveled further than the body can follow. I opened the notebook on my knee and wrote a single sentence that didn't waver, even as the car did. I will not let this pass. The road unwound in long, dark ribbons. When the taxi finally turned into the gravel drive and the house came into view, the sky over Pine Hollow burned the color of marigolds. Grandma drew in a breath that sounded like relief and something heavier. We stepped out into the cool air, and the old suitcase, faithful companion of 1,000 imagined journeys, bumped once against the porch step, as if to remind us both that we had come back without the world we'd been promised. The morning after we returned from the airport, the fog still clung low over Pine Hollow. I drove into town, my hands tight on the steering wheel, and parked in front of Cedar Brew. The cafe smelled of fresh ground beans and cinnamon from the morning pastries. A wall clock ticked slowly above a shelf of mismatched mugs. At a corner table sat Gideon Holt, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, the kind of eyes that notice what others miss. I slid into the seat across from him, the manila envelope on my lap feeling heavier than it was. Thanks for meeting me, I said. I'm told you've got something important, he replied. I started from the beginning, the sudden way my family had become attentive, the suggestion that Grandma contribute $30,000 to a once-in-a-lifetime trip, the weeks of evasive answers, and finally the morning at Seattle-Tacoma, when her name had been absent from the list. I pushed the printout from Rose across the table, then the airline manifest from the check-in desk. Gideon studied them with the patience of a man assembling a puzzle. If this is accurate, it's not a misunderstanding. It's financial exploitation of an elder, which means we treat it as both a crime and a breach of trust. He looked up. I'll need more. Witness testimony, complete financial trail, anything that proves intentional removal of her from that trip after payment was taken. Lila came to mind, the airline employee who had heard my father say she wasn't well enough to travel. I think I can get that, I said. When I brought it to Grandma that afternoon, she was at the kitchen table peeling an apple in one unbroken coil. I told her I wanted to file a formal report. She set the knife down and shook her head. "They're my children, Zephyr. You don't take your own to court. They took you to the airport in front of the world and left you there," I said. "If you stay silent, they'll do it again to you or someone else. You've spent your life saving people. Let me return the favor." Her fingers tightened around the peel before she let it drop into the bowl. She didn't say yes, but she didn't forbid me either. The next day, Rose printed a certified record of the transfer, complete with timestamps and account details, every figure matching the Blake & Cumber travel account. Lila agreed to write a statement describing my father's words at the counter, the exact phrasing about her not being well enough to go. That night, while I was cataloging the evidence, my phone buzzed with a message from a college friend in Paris. "Look who I just ran into." It was a photo of Malcolm, Evelyn, Celeste, Warren, Harper, and Liam in front of the Eiffel Tower, arms linked in perfect symmetry. I stared at the image, then at the scarf around Celeste's neck. Silk dove gray with the faint blush pattern, Grandma's scarf, the one she had folded into the corner of her suitcase. I could almost feel the fabric between my fingers. I sent the photo to Gideon. Minutes later, he called. "When they return, we serve the papers at the airport. They'll have no chance to spin it first." I ended the call and looked again at the frozen smiles in the picture at the tower behind them and the scarf in front. I thought of the silence in the taxi that day, the way Grandma had clutched the family photo like a lifeline. This time I told myself no one walks away untouched. 3 weeks later, I stood with Gideon in the echoing arrivals hall of Portland International. The air smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant, the kind of scent that clings to luggage belts and boarding gates. My bag was heavy with the folder, Rose's bank record, Lila's statement, the passenger list. "They'll be through here in a few minutes," Gideon said, scanning the crowd. I recognized them before I saw their faces: Malcolm's stride, Evelyn's beige trench coat, Warren's tailored blazer, Celeste's deliberate poise. Their suitcases rolled behind them, tags marked CDG, Paris. And there it was, the gray silk scarf around Celeste's neck, draped as if it had always been hers. We stepped forward together. Malcolm Reed, Evelyn Reed, Celeste, Blake, Warren Blake. Gideon said, his voice carrying over the hum of reunions and farewells. "I'm with Adult Protective Services. This is a summons for investigation into elder financial exploitation." Malcolm's face flushed a deep, furious red. "This is a mistake," he said, looking around as if for an ally in the crowd. Evelyn turned on me. "You've destroyed this family," she said, her voice trembling, not with grief, but with anger. Celeste's smile was slow and cutting. "Just like your mother," she said. "Sentimental, foolish, predictable." Gideon held his ground. In addition to the initial $30,000, records show that while in Paris, Blake and Comer withdrew an additional $5,000 from a joint fund belonging to Ms. Margot Wren. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The crowd seemed to part around us. "I'm doing this for her," I said quietly, my voice steady. "Not for you, and not for me." They gathered their luggage without another word, pivoting toward the exit. As they did, a camera flash popped. A man I recognized from the Willamette Gazette lowered his lens and gave Gideon a nod. Every movement, the handoff of the documents, Celeste's scarf, Malcolm's flush, was preserved. The next morning, the front page bore the headline, "Local Family Accused of Elder Financial Abuse." Below it was the photo from the terminal, Celeste mid-blink, the scarf vivid against her coat. Gideon's hand extended with the papers. I folded the paper and set it on Grandma's table. She glanced at it, then at me. For the first time in weeks, the corners of her mouth lifted just slightly. I knew it was far from over. They would hit back harder than before. But this time, we were already standing. The week after the airport confrontation, Pine Hollow's courthouse stood under a cold gray sky. The old brick walls seemed to hold decades of whispered disputes, and the varnished wooden benches creaked when we sat. I was beside Grandma and Gideon, the case files arranged in a neat stack on the table before us. Across the aisle, Malcolm, Evelyn, Celeste, and Warren sat shoulder to shoulder with their sharply dressed attorney, their faces drawn tight in rehearsed composure. When the session began, Gideon methodically laid out the evidence, the certified bank transfer record from Rose, the airline's passenger manifest, and Lila's written statement. His voice was steady, free of the heat that burned in my chest. The opposing attorney rose smoothly. These funds were a voluntary gift, he said, his tone almost pitying. The trip's arrangements changed due to legitimate concerns for Ms. Wren's health. Lila was called to the stand. She sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, and repeated word for word what my father had said at the counter that morning. My mother isn't strong enough to travel, her ticket's already canceled. She confirmed that Grandma had never requested a cancellation. Gideon then presented an email chain recovered from Warren's travel company. The subject line read, "Passenger adjustment, Florence itinerary." In it, Warren and Celeste discussed transferring Grandma's seat to Harper, then selling the business class ticket for extra cash to spend in Florence. Celeste's name appeared beside a note. "The timing works, we can cover the villa upgrade." Across the aisle, Celeste lowered her gaze to the table. Warren's fingers tightened around the armrest until his knuckles blanched. When Grandma took the stand, the opposing attorney asked if she'd prefer to let this matter rest for the sake of family peace. She didn't hesitate. "Family doesn't take from each other this way," she said, her voice carrying to the back row. By the afternoon, word had spilled beyond the courthouse. The Willamette Gazette posted a short article summarizing her testimony. In the Pine Hollow Community Facebook group, former patients and neighbors commented in support, sharing stories of how she'd cared for them during long nights in the hospital. Whatever image my relatives had crafted over the years was starting to unravel. The judge announced that the final decision would be delivered the following week. As we stepped into the cool air outside, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The message read, "Drop the case, or your family's secrets will be dragged out for everyone to see." I looked at Grandma. She met my eyes steadily. I knew they weren't done yet. They'd make their final move before the gavel fell. The courtroom was packed the morning of the ruling. Journalists lined the back wall, their cameras ready. Grandma sat beside me, her hands trembling slightly, though her gaze was fixed ahead. Before the session began, Malcolm appeared in the hallway, blocking my path. "Withdraw the case," he said, his voice low. "I'll give the money back. If you don't, I'll tell the court how your mother abandoned her as a child." I stared at him. "She's never abandoned anyone, least of all you." Inside, the judge began by reviewing the evidence, the transfers, the passenger list, the witness statements. "There is sufficient proof of deliberate financial exploitation," he said. The defense argued for leniency, citing family bonds and the unpredictability of international travel, but their words seemed to evaporate into the stillness. Gideon stood one last time. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter an audio recording into evidence," he said. Lila's voice came through the speakers, the clatter of a keyboard, then Warren's voice at the check-in counter. "Selling Malcolm's mother's ticket will give us more cash for that watch in Rome." Celeste's voice followed, casual, dismissive. "She's old, she'll forget soon enough." A ripple moved through the courtroom. The judge's verdict was firm. The defendants were to repay the full $30,000 plus the additional $5,000 withdrawn in Paris with interest. Malcolm and Celeste were stripped of all financial authority over Grandma and removed from any legal documents pertaining to her estate. Malcolm shot to his feet. "This is an insult," he barked. Evelyn began to cry. Celeste turned away, and Warren gripped her arm, steering her toward the door. I took Grandma's hand. She smiled faintly. "We did it," she said, as if testing the truth of it aloud. When we stepped outside, the wind carried the faint scent of chrysanthemums from somewhere nearby. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line: "Today." Justice stood beside her. A week after the verdict, the morning air was cool and clean, sunlight slanting through the kitchen window of Grandma's cedar-framed house in Pine Hollow. We sat together on the porch, steam curling up from our marigold tea. She turned the worn notebook in her hands, thumbing through the pages I'd filled over the past months. Gideon called while we were still sipping. His voice carried a quiet satisfaction. The repayment had begun, though Warren's accounts were frozen while investigators traced other transactions. It wasn't just the $35,000 from the trip. There were smaller withdrawals spread over 2 years, quietly taken from her savings. When Malcolm and Celeste tried to fight back, they hired a new attorney and flooded social media with accusations that I had fabricated everything to seize control of her estate. But their campaign didn't last. Former patients, retired nurses, and neighbors came forward sharing stories of her kindness, how she'd driven them to the hospital in snowstorms, stayed by their bedsides, bought groceries when cupboards were bare. The community pressure was so relentless, the appeal was dismissed before it reached the docket. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of old boxes in her spare room, I found a bundle of letters from my grandfather. In one, he wrote about the year Malcolm left home at 18, leaving her to raise Celeste alone. She read it over my shoulder and said quietly, "They'd hoped to use this as a weapon against you. But everyone has mistakes. What matters is what we choose to do afterward." She decided to rewrite her will. I would be named sole manager of all her assets and savings with an explicit clause preventing Malcolm, Celeste, or Warren from having any financial authority over her. Most of her money, she said, would go to a scholarship fund for medical students from Pine Hollow. That evening, as the light shifted through the trees, I realized this fight had never been about revenge. It was about ensuring she could live and be remembered on her own terms. She squeezed my hand. "You did what I couldn't," she told me. "You stood up to family to protect what's right." Before leaving, I hung her marigold painting back in the living room. The late sun lit each petal until it seemed the flowers were burning with quiet fire. The story was finally in its rightful place. The truth was no longer hidden. By the start of 2025, the marigold painting hung above my desk at the Pine Hollow Hospital. My notebook, nearly full, rested beside the day's patient charts. Between appointments, I added the last fragments of her story, writing in the same steady hand she had once taught me to hold. Grandma's days became gentle but full. She joined the senior art club, learned watercolor techniques, and spent afternoons with Rose and Lila. I kept working at the hospital, taking on extra clinic hours for elderly patients who couldn't pay. She often repeated, "We give back what life gave us." At a spring exhibit, she displayed a new marigold painting, this one signed in looping script Margot Wren, for Zephyr. Months later, when her lungs weakened, she refused chemotherapy. She wanted her last days at home with the sound of the pines outside and the glint of the creek through the window. On her final morning, she called me her doctor and smiled before drifting to sleep for the last time. Her funeral was simple marigolds on the altar, a modest service at the Pine Hollow Church. Malcolm, Celeste, Warren, and Evelyn didn't attend, but the pews were filled with townspeople, former patients, and colleagues who had known her decades before. Afterward, while straightening her bed, I found an envelope tucked beneath her pillow. "Zephyr, you are my light. Don't let the world harden you." Inside was a folded plane ticket to Paris, never booked, with a note. "You already took me somewhere beautiful with your heart." In the weeks that followed, I shared our story online. Family are the people who choose you. Justice is worth the fight. Love leaves a legacy, I wrote. The town established the Margot Wren Scholarship Fund for aspiring doctors and nurses, its first recipient already preparing to enter medical school. One evening, I closed the notebook for the last time and set it beside her marigold painting. Outside, the sunset pooled gold across the hills, catching the petals in a blaze of light. Her legacy lived on, not just in the scholarship or the painting, but in the choices I made, everyday choices she'd taught me to make without fear. And that's how it ended, not with revenge, but with justice. My grandmother's name cleared, her dignity restored, and her legacy safe from the hands that tried to take it. I learned that family isn't about blood, it's about love, respect, and standing up when it matters most. If my story touched you, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means I can keep sharing stories like this, stories that deserve to be heard. Click subscribe, and let's make sure no voice like hers is ever silenced again.